of seeing some of the videos and thinking to yourself, yeah, I want to be like that guy. I want that guy's life. For girls, it was like the lifestyle you were looking at was sort of like the subservient, sex related object. My third and final pick is a band that's close to my heart. It's Vixen. I actually wore my Vixen t-shirt for the podcast today.
It's hard to come back from that. Honestly, in a relationship, you try to kill your significant other, they're probably not going to want you to come back.
And I don't know, you tell me, were they played very often?
I might have seen them once on Headbangers Ball once.
Hi, I'm Erika.
I'm Dave, and this is Rock of Aging.
This is the podcast where we explore the depths of our hair metal past and what it is about this music and this era that has captivated us for decades. Dave, why don't you tell everyone what we've got coming up?
Sure thing. For episode 14, we're talking about the women of 80s metal.
Excited about this topic for obvious reasons, but I feel like before we dive into the women of 80s metal, we should start out with your segment. Can you tell everyone what your segment is and what it's about? I think we should start there.
For my segment here, we're going to do something called Dave's Not So Deep Dives. So on the show, we do a lot of deep dives into classic albums and stuff, but I listen to all sorts of music, including new releases and classic stuff. So for my first ever Not So Deep Dive, I'm going to talk about the new album from Peter Criss. You know Peter Criss as the former drummer of Kiss. He's the singer on the song Beth, one of the band's biggest songs ever. Well, Peter Criss, who's been out of the band for 20 years, announced last summer that he was putting out a solo album. This will be his first new album in nearly 20 years. And people were like, oh, whoa, what's going on with Peter Criss? Like, why is he doing this? And he said he wanted to make a hard rock album. Okay, now I'm a little suspect at first because what does hard rock mean to somebody who's 79 years old? That's a question. And Peter's solo music outside of Kiss has always been a little bit on the lighter side, a little yacht rock, a little R&B, stuff like that. So I wasn't sure, but he has John Five, currently the guitar player of Motley Crue, playing guitar on the record. He has Billy Sheehan, formerly of David Lee Roth's band and Mr. Big, playing bass. His Paul Schaefer from the old David Letterman band is on there, and a number of other musicians for his hard rock record. Now, I have been listening to it since it came out towards the end of 2025, just like a week or so before Christmas, and I've been listening to it, and it is, by Peter Criss standards, a hard rock record. I mean, there's no question about that. By his standards, it is a hard rock record. By the standards that Erika and I would have for what constitutes a hard rock record, maybe not. Okay, we might not think of it that way. But, if you just want Peter Criss, who, it's not deep. He's like singing songs about rock and roll. He's got a song called Rock and Roll. Okay, another one called Creepy Crawlers and stuff. Like, you're not going for depth. You're going for a guy that's 79 years old, who you've loved since you were a kid, Peter Criss, from your favorite band, in my case, Kiss. And it's like, there's a little bit of just sort of like, he's a homer pick. I'm automatically going to get it no matter what. But I have to say, if it was super terrible, I would tell you, and it's not. It is an improvement over previous Peter Criss solo material, which, like I said, is generally on the lighter side. This is a little bit more on the hard rock side. And if you're a Motley Crue fan or a John Five fan, that's a nice bonus to have him, on there. And then if you're just more a fan of Billy Sheehan from Mr. Big or David Lee Roth, he's on there too. So bottom line is, I would give it a recommendation. If it's for Kiss fans, I'm not going to lie, but it is probably the best Peter Criss music outside of Kiss.
Wow.
There is my not so deep dive on the Peter Criss record.
I think that's a pretty good statement, though. I felt like for a minute there, you were kind of borderline on whether or not you liked it. But then to close with the statement that this is probably the best work he's done, I mean, that's really saying something.
Well, I don't like to bash people, and I'm not. The point of this is not to come on and knock some record and tell you how terrible it is. But with the comparison between Peter's, like this album, self-titled Peter Criss, versus his Kiss solo album, versus the first two records he did after he left Kiss, and some other stuff, it is better than that. Is it
Okay.
as good as Kiss? No, but that's kind of where I'll leave it. I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, not blown away, pleasantly surprised.
I feel like that's all we can hope for at this stage is pleasantly surprised.
So deep dives.
We're going to move on to my solo segment, which every time is going to relate to the episode itself, but I'm just going to do a quick atmosphere check. So this is me sort of diving into what it was actually like during the time frame that we're discussing. So for example, today we're talking about the women of 80s metal, which by the way, there were very few of. And one of the things I wanted to just have our listeners think about is what did it actually feel like for women who were entering metal spaces in the 80s? Now, this could be a concert. Obviously, if you were an older adult at that point and you were somehow in the business, it could have been that sort of a scenario. But for the most part, I'm going to look at it from my personal perspective, which would have been like a 13, 14-year-old girl going to like a show, for example. And I'll tell you that there were a lot of times that sort of environment was kind of scary. You went into it sort of feeling ogled, and like your job at these shows was to offer yourself up in some way as like a groupie or a girlfriend possibility or someone you could potentially at least hit on while the show was happening. There was a definite box and you were expected to get inside the box. And I think that's true for this culture overall. You know, it was all about sex appeal, sex appeal, sex appeal. That's what was valued in this music and in this era, generally speaking. And so for girls in their early teens, like me and my friends, that was really the message. That's how you participate. You know, we've talked about this a little bit before, Dave, where you were kind of seeing some of the videos and thinking to yourself, yeah, I want to be like that guy. I want that guy's life. For girls, it was like the lifestyle you were looking at was sort of like the subservient, you know, sex-related object. And so that's sort of the message that girls got as far as how you participate in this era. And that's why I love that we're doing this episode, because we're really going to talk about some women that bucked the trend. They did more of a great balancing act with their toughness versus their femininity and really kind of breaking some molds in terms of what women were expected to do. So I'm excited to get started. Let's go. So with that in mind and kind of thinking about the Gen Xers that are listening, especially any of the women listeners that we have, I cannot wait to dive into this topic because what we're talking about is not just the music this time. We're talking also about visibility and belonging and how women fit into the culture. So let's talk about for a moment why this topic still matters in 2026. I kind of have my own thoughts on it. There's been a lot of advancement in the way women are viewed in the workplace and as musicians, but sexism obviously still exists. Unequal pay still exists. Women still don't hold as many administrative positions in the music business as men do. In my job, for example, I do work with female promoters, but still way more men. I work with a few female agents, but still way more men. So what do you think, Dave? Like, why is this topic still relevant in 2026 from a man's perspective?
It's relevant today because people still feel the effects of that. And it's almost like you talk about the mythology. Like I read a recent book about the Bangles. It's a little different stylistically, but a big portion of the book was how they were treated so differently as women back then. And yeah, these sort of objectification on the one hand, and then they focus on the cuter girl in the band and they sort of disregard the others, and it put them in a real awkward position because they thought they were all equal. So when you see how it was back then and how people came out the other side, you do realize it is better now. And I think that's important to state, that it is better in 2026 than it was in 1986, no question. But it's still not perfect. I mean, it's still not perfect, but I think it's still relevant because as more and more women are in the industry, we had the Me Too thing a little while ago, and we have all these other things going on. There is a sort of adjustment, and men have had to do most of the adjusting because they're the ones who've had all the control, and they need to cede a little bit of that.
You made a good point too when you just mentioned something about the Bangles, because one thing that I noticed when I was kind of diving into this topic is that in the 80s, women showed up in full force on the pop side of the music industry. We had Madonna, we had Cyndi Lauper, we had Janet Jackson, Whitney Houston, the Bangles, for example, but they were all firmly like in that pop category. Women really didn't enter the rock space at all even if women were a little bit edgier, like the Bangles perhaps, or like Pat Benatar, who, you know, was more of a rock musician, most of those women were still categorized in pop. So even the edgier sounding women were still like firmly in that bucket. And so it was super rare to see women in the rock space. And if you did, they were very sort of like masculine because that's how they had to come across in order to be noticed or relevant or quote unquote fit in. So I think
I
that's
was gonna say there's some like female metal singers from the 80s, like Lee Aaron, for example. I don't know if anyone remembers her. She's Canadian, but she'd have to do that sort of harder. She'd have to be tougher, less. I mean, she was still dressed feminine and sexy because that was the rule. You had to, but she also had to somehow incorporate this sort of toughness or this raw metal kind of thing to make it so that she wasn't seen as pop. And that's just one example, but
and there were others too, like Doro Pesch, for example,
right.
or Lita Ford. Lita Ford had some big commercial success when this type of music took over the airwaves, and she was sort of thought of in the same vein as some of the rock artists, but she also had to wear the rock look, the rock uniform. She had to have the black leather. She had to fit into the mold in her own way. And, you know, it was obviously her image was very sexualized as well. So you could tell that there was someone sort of putting that image on her. I would guess. I actually have talked to some female musicians from that era who said that there was a lot of record labels and other folks in the administrative business sort of pushing a certain image on these women. And so there was definitely a lot of that going on.
In the videos, how they had to appear in the videos. I mean, and as artists, I'm not even saying just the women in the videos as being in the video, but, you know, men could look like they either just woke up or they could dress up like Poison and look like women themselves. It didn't really seem to make that much difference as long as you weren't like fat. That was the no-go in the 80s.
I guess that's true. The only women in metal were really the men dressing like women for whatever reason. That was totally acceptable. But if you were a woman, you needed to behave more masculine. I think that's so interesting. But let's dive into our picks because we each picked 3. So let's start with my first pick. It is the incomparable Gerri Miller. Gerri was the editor of Metal Edge magazine from 1985 until it ceased print production in 2009. And Gerri unfortunately passed away of cancer in 2021. And when she died, there were so many bands who posted tributes to her, sort of citing her as a core supporter in the early days, providing so much guidance to new bands as they were just getting started. And I always knew that the editor of Metal Edge magazine was a woman. I loved Metal Edge magazine. It was something I subscribed to, something I looked forward to every single month. It is interesting to me that the 80s metal vibe was so misogynistic, and to think that there was a woman behind the magazine that my friends and I followed religiously probably speaks in part to the explosion of the genre, because this music exploited women, but it also targeted women. Yeah. And Gerri knew how to curate Metal Edge so that its content was interesting and engaging to the teen girls reading its pages. Like, I think she sort of got that this was the 80s metal version of Teen Beat magazine at the time. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, my friends and I had subscriptions to Metal Edge magazine, and we never, ever read the other rock magazines of the day, like Kerrang or Circus, never. Metal Edge was it for us. And I do think it's because of the way she curated and edited the magazine and the way she spoke to fans. Interestingly enough, Tina, my friend Tina out in LA that I used to host A92A with, our other podcast, she actually had contact with Gerri Miller, and she documents her experience and her encounter in, I think it's like episode 10 of Ages 9 to Adult. It's about 80s metal contests and winners. And she actually had an interaction with Gerri. So this was an iconic person that was kind of near and dear to my heart. And she really was, from all accounts, somebody that was super supportive of these bands and of these guys trying to make it. I think she was probably a little bit of a mother figure.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that you and your friends like read Metal Edge. Mm-hmm. And I did too. I mean, but I also read Circus, Hit Parader, Faces, you know, all of those. Mm-hmm. But I never thought of Metal Edge as a woman curated magazine. Like, it never even entered my brain, even though I knew who Gerri Miller was, and I
Mm-hmm.
knew that she was the editor. I was very, very aware of that. But it never seemed different to me or something unusual as a teenage boy of looking at a heavy metal magazine. It had all the same things that I looked for also.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I think that's a testament to her skill as an editor, especially for the times, is
Right.
that she made the magazine. It was like you saw what you needed to see out of it, and I saw what I needed to see out of it. Because if
Mm-hmm.
it didn't have those things, then if it was just for women, the magazine wouldn't have been as successful. If it was just for men, like it was just Kerrang, it would have been something different too. So
Yeah.
I think that's a testament to her skill as an editor and curator or whatever, that I never thought of it as a woman run magazine. It was
Mm-hmm.
as good as, or if not better than every other metal magazine of the period.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't think it's a coincidence that that was our magazine of choice, that we really didn't pay attention to any of the others. She did know what she was doing, I think, from that perspective. I think it was in the way the photos looked. And, the photos, I remember Tina, in fact, had her whole entire room plastered in photos from Metal Edge magazine. There was no wall space visible. It was like wallpaper. And I just think that a lot of that had to do with the way that Gerri kind of knew how to speak to that audience.
She's known for managing her husband, Ozzy Osbourne, the late Ozzy Osbourne. But that was a task in and of itself. And if people aren't aware, her father is a man named Don Arden, and he's an English music manager who used to manage all of the big bands in the 70s, including Black Sabbath. And he was part of Ozzy getting fired from Black Sabbath. But Ozzy was still under contract to their management company. So he assigned his daughter, Sharon, to go handle Ozzy in Los Angeles. And of course, she ended up reviving his career, making him the legend that he is today. And, single-handedly getting him off the couch or whatever, from being a drunken guy just living in a motel in 1979 in Los Angeles to what he became, which is one of the biggest rock stars of the 80s and 90s and really 2000s. So she played a huge role in that. And I know that a lot of people, she has a reputation as being tough. They call her a ball buster. Oh, she's so mean. She's a bitch or whatever. It's like, you know what? That's called being effective. People are afraid of Sharon Osbourne. They don't cross her. They don't want her to, they don't want to get on her bad side because she is so effective at her job. She was amazing with Ozzy. I mean, had so much control over everything. And she also did manage other artists briefly. She managed Gary Moore, Motorhead, Lita Ford, Smashing Pumpkins, and Coal Chamber at one point. But primarily her job was handling the career of her late husband, or her husband at the time, Ozzy Osbourne. And I have to say that, like, when you look at managers, not just like women managers, but just managers in general, I don't think there's anyone like Sharon. I mean, I think she is one of the best ever to do it. 80s, 90s, whatever it was. She's phenomenal.
Well, I really don't even know how she did a job with Ozzy as her partner, as someone that she's involved in, obviously, very intimately. I mean, just dealing with him on a professional level, I can't imagine how frustrating and just like beating your head against the wall every single day. Because when you're dealing with somebody with severe issues with addiction, that's such a hard thing to stay focused on. I think I would have lost interest like almost immediately.
Well, there were some incidents that would have pushed most people away. I mean, he did attempt to kill her at one point in the 80s when he was in a drunken
no biggie.
stupor. Right. And it's hard to come back from that. Honestly, in a relationship, you try to kill your significant other, they're probably not going to want you to come back, but she did, and they had other, spats over there in their relationship at times where they weren't, getting along great, but she never let that affect the business. She was his manager one way, and then his wife something else. So I'm
she
sure
was really able. She was really able to like compartmentalize those roles.
It was, and that would be very, very
dealing
difficult.
With management, Sharon, and tomorrow I'm going to have to deal with wife Sharon and work on that role. But she was really brilliant at it. I don't know how she did it, but she was good at it.
And it's the family drama of her family, the Ardens. I mean, her dad was the manager of Black Sabbath. They fire Ozzy, and then they dump Ozzy on her because they figure like whatever, you just take care of him. And then
Thanks,
he
Dad.
ends up becoming so much more successful than Black Sabbath was in the 80s. He dominated the decade. They were almost nothing. So, she proved what she needed to prove. She's an amazing manager. And of course, she came up with Ozfest and all of these other things that she did later on in her career. And I imagine now for the rest of her days, she'll be handling Ozzy's legacy since he has passed on, I would guess. But no, great, powerful person in the industry, no question.
Moving on to my second pick, the next person I want to talk about is Penelope Spheeris. And she turned 80 in 2025. She is still with us. And I'm specifically bringing up Penelope because she directed one of the most influential movies for me to come out of the 80s, Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years. This was a documentary that was released in 1988. I have seen this film countless times. It's titled Part 2 because Penelope first directed Decline of Western Civilization in 1981, which was a look at the punk scene in LA. But Part 2 was all about the LA heavy metal scene, especially the glam metal movement, and centered on the clubs of Sunset Strip. And the influx of young musicians coming to LA to start or to join a rock band. I mean, obviously, this is a time when the Strip was cranking. I mean, it was like shows every night, bands trying to make it, record labels kind of canvassing the area to try to find the next big superstar. Many rockers did outtakes and were included in this film. Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons of Kiss, Alice Cooper, Chris Holmes of Wasp, Ozzy Osbourne, Aerosmith, Poison. I don't ever remember knowing a whole lot about Penelope Spheeris. Remember, there was no internet at the time. And so in small town Nebraska, I would have been hard pressed to find a lot of info about Penelope and her career. But she gained more notoriety later in the early 90s when she directed the classic film Wayne's World, which was also a favorite of mine. I believe that because this film was directed by a woman, there was more depth than there may have been should a man have directed it. And the reason I say that is because the subject matter was very exploitive of women. And it would have been easy to kind of characterize every man as a narcissistic jerk. But she really did search through the facade for the why behind the newer band's drive. She gave the film a heart. She interviewed a lot of women. Vixen was part of this as well. And there were a lot of discussions about the way women were treated in this scene that we're talking about here. Groupies, women were used for money or a place to live. A lot of bands fully admitted to kind of sponging off of women to basically make it through their day. And so it was very exploitive of women, but the movie was so good at really capturing the heart behind these musicians and how bad they wanted it and their struggle also.
It's a great movie. And I like part one as well. The punk rock one. It's so radically different than this one. I mean, it just shows how different LA was from 1980 to 1987 or whatever. The whole scene had completely turned around. But she does a good job of capturing it, displaying it very well, and not adding in any sort of judgment or editorial sort of say. It shows you what's happening in the scenes, in the punk one and in the metal one. Both of them are done very well in the fact that, she's not heavy-handed with her opinion. She allows the people in the movie to do the talking and to, it's about them and they're the ones who are basically telling the story. She's more or less capturing it and putting it together in the right way.
Yeah, and she did a part 3 also, which I think was in the early 90s. It was about young homeless musicians and kind of like the plight of some of these younger kids, again, that were coming into LA to seek their millions. But she was an iconic director, is an iconic director. She's done many, many films. This just happens to be the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart. And again, like I watched this documentary so many times. So many of the bands that she featured actually did become like pretty big stars, like Poison, for example. They were really just coming up the ranks when she filmed this documentary. And then, of course, they exploded later on after that. But, you know, and then you've got other bands. Poor London. London was a band that just had one member after another, just rotated them through. And all of the band members that seemed to have left made it big, but the ones that stayed, I mean, poor London just never made it. So you had a lot of those stories as well.
Yeah. London and Odin were the two bands. They're perpetually stuck on the strip. They just never, they never got beyond that, but people would quit the band and then they become famous with somebody else. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay, my number 2 choice is I'm going with the band Girlschool. Girlschool has a little bit more of a following in the UK, and they're not as well known in the United States. They were part of the new wave of British heavy metal that occurred in the late 70s, early 80s. They're peers of Motorhead, and they've done collaborations with Motorhead, and they're associated with them, and they look almost like a female Motorhead. I mean, that's kind of what they look like. Their best known songs were probably Come On, Let's Go, Please Don't Touch, which featured Motorhead, and I'm the Leader of the Gang. Those are probably their best known songs. But Girlschool is the longest running all-female rock band ever. They started in 1978 and they have never broken up. Now, they've gone in hiatuses and whatnot, but that means they're there for almost 50 years, and they are the longest running all-female rock band that is still active. So
amazing.
That's something that's pretty important. Now, when you discuss their career, you know, they were so friendly with all of these other bands that were going on in England in the early 80s, but what they realized was there was a certain amount of sexism going on that, yeah, they could hang out with the boys and they could do all this stuff, but they didn't have hits the same way some of their peers did. They didn't have platinum records. They didn't have that sort of stuff. They were always opening for these other bands. And so I think that they can absolutely attribute that to the sexism of the 80s, that they were treated better than, say, a groupie, but they maybe weren't even treated that respectfully as musicians. But I think you look back, they've been together for over 40 years. I mean, the longest running band in whatever, longest running female rock band. So they obviously did something, you know?
That's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the current members right now are Kim McAuliffe, Denise Dufort, Jackie Chambers, and Olivia Airy. They are not all the original members. They have had some lineup changes over the years, but yeah, they're still going. And if you go to, like, I don't know, Apple Music or whatever, and just go on like a Girlschool best of or something, there's a lot of good songs that really never had an audience in America because they almost had no audience in America. It was almost exclusively Europe and the UK. And their stuff is a lot catchier than Motorhead. I mean, you know what I mean? Like they were sort of like a female Motorhead, but their songs were a lot catchier than the average Motorhead song. So it's certainly a group that is worth revisiting because I don't think they get their due when you talk about, you know, all female rock bands. You know, the Girlschool frequently gets skipped over and are just not talked about at all.
This was not a band I even know. Like, clearly, like, I was not their target, I guess. I don't know. I mean, if they had more fans over in the UK than they did in the US, then maybe that makes a lot of sense. Again, living in small town Nebraska, it's like how you come across this music is questionable. You know, you'd have to be exposed to it somewhere, like either through albums or something in a record store or on MTV. And I don't know, you tell me, were they played very often on MTV?
I might have seen them once on Headbangers Ball once. And that would be about it. They certainly never got massive rotation or, you know, they didn't get played the same way you would play like a Motorhead or a Guns N' Roses or even a Vixen. You know, they didn't get any of that. But because they were trailblazers. I mean, when they were coming up in the late 70s, early 80s, I'm sure they caught a ton of shit just for being women in the industry. And yeah, there were plenty of people who eventually would be like, yeah, that band's great or whatever. But there was still at that time, I just know from being alive at that time, like, yeah, it was, they weren't given the same respect as some of the other bands that they were peers with.
Well, it kind of appears that maybe they were a UK version of the Runaways or, you know, kind of had the same kind of vibe. Although I'll be honest, I have not listened to their music. So now I need to go check it out. If they're a little bit more melodic than some of the Motorhead stuff, then I think it might kind of be my jam. So I'll have to.
I would say it is.
My third and final pick is a band that's close to my heart. It's Vixen. I actually wore my Vixen t-shirt for the podcast today. So Vixen was really one of the only all-female bands that got into the circle, so to speak. They had the videos on MTV, they had the hits on the radio, they had great album sales. And so this was really, if you were a woman and you wanted to aspire to being a rock musician, this was sort of like your band. They formed in St. Paul, Minnesota, actually, in 1973, but they were most commercially successful from 1987 to 1992-ish. And they were well known for hits like Edge of a Broken Heart and Crying. The original four members were Jan Kunemund, Janet Gardner, Cher Ross, and Roxy Petrucci. I was lucky enough to meet Cher and Roxy in 2021 when they opened for Skid Row and Dokken in Council Bluffs, Iowa, not far from Omaha. Now the band's only original member is Roxy, the group's drummer. But they do have a great current lineup with the addition of Britt Lightning on guitar. She's fantastic. She's also kind of the administrative head of Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp. And so she's working with students, adult students, and kids too, I'm sure, that come to the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp program. And then Julia Lodge on bass and Rosa Larchiude on vocals. Cher, by the way, is a realtor in Florida. She most recently the band. And she was still part of the band when I saw them in 2021. But I love following Cher because she mentioned this to us in person as well when we met her, but she loves being a realtor. And she talks about her experiences a lot. It's hard to explain what this band, really meant to me, though, at age 13 in 1987, because I mean, this was just it. Women were really only portrayed as video props during glam's heyday. And so to see women actually doing the thing was mind blowing. I actually got a guitar for Christmas around this time because I finally saw what that could look like. And I wanted to be part of the band, but didn't see how that would ever work. It just wasn't done. Like I wasn't seeing it visually. And then Vixen came along. And as they always say, representation matters. And, I'll be honest, I never actually did learn how to play the guitar. I think I probably took like 5 or 6 lessons and then I lost interest. But I think Vixen is still partially responsible for how I ended up in the live music business booking shows. All of these women, as a matter of fact, because I saw that it was absolutely possible to be part of live music in a different way, to be part of the concert industry in a multitude of ways. It wasn't just groupies. They all encouraged me kind of to find my niche and just do the work and go for it. So I love Vixen. I still love Vixen. I love the original 4 members. Unfortunately, Jan has passed away. Janet, I think, was on a documentary recently, and she works like as a dental hygienist somewhere or something.
Oh, right. I did see that. Yeah.
Still makes music. She still makes music. And then, like I said, Cher is a realtor in Florida and Roxy's still with the band. So I love the original 4, but the new lineup is fantastic as well.
They did have a relatively short career, but they left a huge impression because here they are, 40 years later after their initial run, they're still going.
Yeah. Now it will be interesting if and when Roxy ever decides to leave the band. She is the only original member that's left. It will be interesting to see like how Vixen is portrayed or how fans react to Vixen. It's a lot like we've talked about on this podcast too, like Foreigner, who's now got no original members in the band. It's like, is it still Foreigner? So, those questions are always going to, I think, kind of follow them around, especially if Roxy ever decides to leave. But for now, she's still part of the band and it's
still part of the band. We'll have to address that when it happens, because as some people might remember, one of my Festivus grievances was bands touring with no original members. So if she does decide to leave, I don't know, something might change there. That's all I'm saying. My third and final choice for this episode is Wendy O Williams, the lead singer of the Plasmatics. And Plasmatics didn't really have any hit songs in their run. I mean, they really didn't, but they left such a huge impression, and it's almost entirely due to Wendy O Williams. The Plasmatics existed from, say, 1978 to maybe 1988 or so, and there was controversy everywhere they went. I mean, police just used to assault Wendy O Williams. They would, like, she was a threat to society or whatever. They just couldn't deal with her. And everywhere she went, there was controversy. There was always this sort of drama. But I remember as a young boy at like 11 or 12 years old, and I knew who Wendy O Williams was. I was very aware of the Plasmatics, even though they didn't have a hit song. I couldn't tell you what any of their records were called, it was like, I knew who Wendy O Williams was because she stood out. You know, she was just so different from literally everyone. She didn't get, like I said, she didn't get the success at the time that some of the other bands had, but they were really abrasive and very, very tough for mainstream audiences. I mean, I'm not surprised that they didn't have hits because, frankly, like some of their stuff, you know, just couldn't be a hit. I mean, their best known songs are probably "It's My Life" off of Wendy's solo album, "Sex Junkie," "Butcher Baby," which is where the band Butcher Babies gets their name from, and "A Pig is a Pig," which was written after she was assaulted by a number of police officers in Milwaukee. That's the song that she came up with to tell the experience. Plasmatics kind of stopped in about 1983. They were having a dispute with their record company who, you know, wanted to have a little bit more control. And so Gene Simmons came in with the idea of, why don't you just call it WOW, Wendy O Williams? I'll produce it. You can go to another label. Now you're not the Plasmatics anymore. So, but it basically was a Plasmatics record with all of the Plasmatics on there. Plus Ace Frehley was on it. Paul Stanley was on it. Eric Carr was on it. And Gene Simmons played bass on it under the name Reginald Van Helsing. He didn't play under his own name. And the Plasmatics came to Kiss's attention and came to the world's attention in this metal world. They're very closely tied in because the 1983 Kiss tour for Creatures of the Night featured 3 openers in various legs. 1 was Motley Crue, 2 was Night Ranger, and 3 was Wendy O Williams. Or I'm sorry, the Plasmatics. Not just Wendy. Gene Simmons saw something in Wendy O Williams. I mean, you know, he did try to make it a little more commercial. If you listen to her WOW album, that's the most catchy thing she ever did. And the song "It's My Life" is actually an unreleased Kiss song, and it's phenomenal. She does it well, but the Kiss version is really good. She broke so many barriers for other female artists. I mean, I named the Butcher Babies, but I mean, I could just think of, 100 other vocalists that saw Wendy O Williams and saw her style and how bold she was and how fearless she was, and was like, yeah, I want to do that. Maybe a little bit more so in the 90s, because she, I think, inspired people a little bit later on, like a Courtney Love or somebody like that could have perhaps been inspired by her. But so I think she's left a great legacy. I think she's super, super important. Sadly, she did take her own life in, I want to say 1998. I think she actually did take her own life. She had long-term problems with depression and stuff. And so it was a really sad ending to her career. But nevertheless, she left behind a lot of great stuff. Not as much as you might think. Only really 7 albums in her entire career. But most of them are pretty memorable.
Yeah, this is another artist that I don't think I was the target for her. She I knew who she was, sort of, but she was really she was kind of scary. Like for me anyway, and this is really just coming from my own perspective, from my own perspective, as like a kid really who never really got into the wild side of this scene. I always often say that if I actually would have been an adult and been in LA on the Sunset Strip during the 80s, I don't think I would have made it. Like, I think I would have been so repulsed by most of what I saw that I would have bailed. So, it was safe for me to be a fan, in my little small town in Nebraska. But somebody like Wendy O Williams she was a little rough for me. Like she would have scared the shit out of me if I. I mean,
she scared the shit out of most men too. I mean,
yeah, and that's not to say anything or take anything away from her, because I think she's amazing. I think that she really did break a lot of barriers. I think absolutely she had to have been an inspiration for some of the women that came after her. And so from that perspective, it's amazing that she, was able to do what she did. But she just wasn't. She's not somebody I know a whole lot about, or really have ever really even listened to much of their music. So I
mean, my advice for anyone listening or watching us right now is that maybe don't start with a Plasmatics record if you're looking to get into this band. It's good, and you can get into it later. But if you can listen to this WOW record, which is about the catchiest, most commercial sounding she's ever been, if that's still too rough for you, then maybe she's not going to be for you. But this album is still really good. And as a Kiss fan, every Kiss fan should have it, considering Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, and Eric Carr are all playing on it. Amazing legacy, really interesting. There's some good documentaries on YouTube about her and detailing like what happened in Milwaukee and some of the other stuff. So there's a lot to learn about Wendy O Williams. She was
Well,
really,
and
really
it's so
cool.
interesting too, like just even talking about this subject, and even as we start to wrap it up, like when I think about women performing rock music now, like I still can't really, name off a bunch of them. There's artists like Spirit Box or Lizzie Hale from Hailstorm. There definitely are some women that are out there doing amazing things and producing really good quality music, but there still aren't a lot of them. Like they're still kind of few and far between. Evanescence is another one that comes to mind, but they are still few and far between.
As time has gone on, there has been less sexism, not an elimination of it, but less.
Yeah, I do think in the 90s, probably women went through a renaissance for sure in terms of popularity. Although there were, like I named off a handful of women in the 80s too that were very pop focused, that were massive stars, that still are, some of them still performing. So this was a great episode. I love that we are able to talk about women in a genre that's really so well known for men and for the exploitation of women. I love that we're really talking about the women that broke the mold and did other things. I can't wait until our next episode, Dave, because we're talking about MTV. And I love me some MTV. So
yeah, if you really want to do a retro look at how, the way MTV affected people like us, that's going to be on our next episode.
Yes, so definitely tune in. It will air just a couple of weeks from now, because now we're doing them every 2 weeks, which is exciting.
Yeah, right. Important show note, shortened show update. We are now going to have episodes not only just on the 10th of every month, but then again on the 25th of the month. So you can get us every 2 weeks, just about. So remember the 10th and the 25th, mark your calendar. Those are the days for the episodes of Rock of Aging. In the meantime, look for us on Instagram and Facebook, and we also have a Spotify playlist and everything like that. So we're putting it out there. We're keeping ourselves busy here in the new year with 2026.
Yes, love it. So definitely follow us on Instagram, as Dave mentioned, and tune in next time when we're talking all about MTV. We'll see you guys soon.
Yes. Adios.